Welcome back. Here watching SA Today, and we're going to start unpacking, of course, what we've just heard, and that's President Cyril Ramaphosa responding to the debates that played out yesterday around his State of the Nation, where opposition parties lashed out at him, saying that his speech was nothing but an empty dream. Opposition parties have accused the president of lacking detail to implement his vision, whilst the ANC refuted allegations that the speech is low on tangible solutions to grow the economy. Opposition parties also said that President Ramaphosa's State of the Nation address last week did not inspire any confidence, especially in relation to the land issue. Well, to unpack this, we're joined in studio by one of our regular unpackers, Senior Research Fellow at the Trade Collective, Lebohang Pheko. Thanks so much for joining us. Welcome to the program.
Thank you.
All right, so it's been interesting for me to observe, actually, the reaction to the president's speech last week and what was debated during the course of this week, and then his response. And it seems that this idea that a president could dream was a problem, and he spent quite a bit in couching his speech today in justifying the words that he used last week. Unpack that for me.
So yes, I mean, I think last week we heard something like a Martin Luther King type, I have a dream, I have a vision, and you know, our biggest problem is that we don't dream boldly enough, we don't imagine ourselves differently, we don't imagine ourselves as an industrializing, fully employed, healthy nation, and so on, without, as you say, you know, a bit thin on the detail. And then today he reiterated that the power of imagination, the power of dreaming, and then reiterated to buttress that some of the visions and the interventions that he's intending to take. So some more summits, you know, some more figures on unemployment, some more words that were spoken about industrialization, digitization, a new approach, which isn't so new, to our education crisis, and trying to match the sorts of skills we have to the kind of economy that we want to build. But there are a few things I think that are slightly amiss in all of this. So the one thing is that having skills and growing an economy, unfortunately, are not necessarily a panacea. They're not necessarily a match. There are lots of people with skills who are driving taxis or who are doing nothing in particular. So the whole notion that the problem that we have is one of skills or the appropriate skills isn't necessarily true, unfortunately. It's the kind of economy that we have, which is the real issue. The second is really, I mean, in principle, dreaming and imagining ourselves differently is fine, but doing so within an existing framework, so one that is very market orthodox, which for 25 years has not been effective, that has suggested that foreign direct investment or that having an investor-friendly environment is what is going to galvanize growth, again, hasn't proved itself very well over the last quarter of a century. And thirdly, that the kind of growth that we need, whether it's related to inflation targeting, keeping interest rates at a particular level, whether those fundamentals alone are again sufficient to enable a growing economy, again, has not proved itself to be true. And then I think lastly, we probably need to rethink our language of what a healthy, growing economy looks like. Countries like Nigeria, Ethiopia, and so on are illustrating that having a high unemployment rate and having high growth rates are not diametrically opposed. Having so-so GDP figures and again having high economic growth rates again are not diametrically opposed. So chasing GDP growth per se is not necessarily the answer to economic growth, or in fact doesn't even indicate economic growth.
All right, so we'll unpack some of the things that you've said one by one, but I want to get a sense of the overall speech. So people were having to make up their minds on what he tried to say in the State of the Nation address. Then they got some input from the opposition parties and some of the governing parties yesterday. Was his response enough based on what we've heard on the SONA day and the debate yesterday? Do you think that he came out today with a position that was clear and that people could say, okay, my president, I hear you?
Clearer. I don't think clear enough. Perhaps it was enough to, well, he seems to be getting a standing ovation, so somebody seems to be convinced. You know, the thing with these sorts of things, Peter, is that it's not only is it important for other people to be convinced, but I think that it needs to convince the speaker, the conveyor.
Yeah.
And that is what really bolsters public sentiment and even economic sentiment. So he reiterated, I think he came out a bit more strongly than he did last week. And I think that he perhaps tried to close a few gaps by naming a few more tangibles. The one thing that's quite apparent is that there's nothing particularly new. And I think this musical chairs with policy and framing that he has been playing, which many of which are inheritances from previous administrations, other departments, you know, the example of new cities and digitized cities and, you know, these sorts of things. There's nothing new. I think people like former Housing Minister Sisulu have been saying these things. Cities like Ekurhuleni have been talking about an aeropolitan city for a long time. So what's perhaps disappointing is presenting these as though they are completely new, fresh and innovative ideas, and they're really not. And there's nothing wrong with recycling. I think what's problematic is recycling without giving context and perhaps without giving content as to why these things, these trajectories haven't been successful previously. And I still think that that's incredibly thin.
All right. Okay, we're going to take a break shortly, but just before that, and after the break, we're also going to be joined in this conversation by Angelo Fick. But just before that, the other thing that I always worry about often is when I listen and watch what goes on in Parliament and these speeches, I often think about, you know, my grandmother in rural South Africa, rural Zimbabwe, rural wherever.
Well, anyway.
And I'm thinking if they listen to this, can they even relate to the language and the conversation? Is this a state of the nation response debate for intellectuals, or are we leaving out the general masses sometimes in some of these conversations?
Yeah, that's always an interesting point. I mean, we have in our constitution this commitment to public participation, and that which is not only about linguistic, but as you rightly say, about also contextualizing and deconstructing conversations and making them more meaningful and relatable for people across the spectrum of society. I mean, this is quite highbrow stuff. There's no doubt about it. I think it's highbrow, whether it's in Xhosa, Venda, Sesotho, you know, Sizulu, Sitonga. It's highbrow stuff. What I think most people will relate to is tangibles, targets, and I think an idea that this social compact is something that they are also a part of. I mean, throwing words like social cohesion without in any way trying to give them a context in today's society, which is incredibly fractured, slightly despondent, is not particularly useful.
All right, okay, we're going to take a quick break, and when we come back, we'll continue with this conversation, unpacking the President's response to the debate that took place yesterday following his State of the Nation address last week. And don't forget, we'd love to hear your thoughts as well, because we could sit here and have this conversation, but it's what your take was on this that's quite important. At SA Today _SABC, what are your thoughts on what you heard the President say today in response to the debate that took place yesterday?